Welcome to Hero or Disruptor, exploring the power of teaching metaphors. I'm Garth Neufeld. In this series, Jane Hallinan and I take a deep dive into the hero's journey as applied to teaching, while also considering the transformational power of disruption. So where will you see yourself? As a guide to the next generation of heroes? Or as a disruptor of the status quo? Wherever you find yourself. Thanks for joining us on this journey. Hi, listeners. The conversation you are about to hear between myself, Garth Neufeld, and Jane Hallinan is one that grew out of some email correspondences where I approached her about potentially working on a writing project related to heroic teaching. And she rightfully asked, what does that mean? And so we started a correspondence back and forth, which led to, I think, some misunderstanding about what this was, some realization that I was a little clear about what the ideas were at that point, and wanted to kind of use her as a sounding board to work through them. This wasn't easily done by email, and so we decided to have a recorded conversation about it. And what this first conversation turned into was a conversation about choosing a metaphor that helps make sense of your career and your career as a teacher. Some image that helps ground the things that we do. And what we realized is that there are a lot of images out there, and those can be mined for all kinds of connections. And sometimes they are a good fit, and sometimes they're not. We talk about being a juggler. We talk about weaving. We talk about being a mushroom grower. We talk about a lot of things. But here's what you should do. Prepare yourself for a conversation that is really a feeling out process. And then, as we get into subsequent episodes, we'll hope to define more of what it means to teach using a metaphor, and maybe specifically the metaphor as a hero, or the metaphor as the disturber, as Jane likes to refer to herself. And maybe you'll find your own metaphor, and maybe something here will resonate with you. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for going on this journey with us on teaching metaphors. Jane, I never know how to start these things, but this conversation, well, we don't know what it's going to be, but it came about in an interesting way where I tried to, oh, by the way, Jane Hallinan, welcome.
Oh, thank you.
Well, this came in an interesting way because I had an idea. You and I like to share ideas.
We do.
Mm-hmm. And I had an idea, and then it was the beginning of the term. Actually, it was summer before it was the beginning of the term. You said you were going to take some time in summer not to think about work. So
I think I said, leave me alone. I think that's what I said. I might not have been that direct, but I said, I'm trying to take summer off.
You know how sensitive I am, so I don't think you said that to me. But I gave you space in summer. I said, when you're ready to look at this, and then I never heard back from you. And then it was the beginning of term. And then I started bothering you with more frequency. And then you said, I don't know why I've been putting this off.
That's true.
Yeah.
And I could feel myself actively avoiding thinking about it. And that's a little unusual for me.
Yeah. And people have no idea what we're talking about yet, which is great. It's great. It's great it's good podcasting, really, is to keep the listener intrigued. But so I'll just say how this all started. A number of years ago, and I don't even think I've told you this whole story, but a number of years ago, I wrote let me back up. A number of years ago, I started a couple of nonprofits and realized that I had all this passion to do these things. But I mean, everything was a learning curve. And so everything was, a struggle, and I wasn't doing it. I'm sure there's industry standards or best practices if you had like a marketing degree or something like that, or if you were some sort of business, but I didn't have any of those things. And so I was just kind of making it up as I went along. And then you find sources and mentors and things that help you along the way. And then I came across this book, and this book was called Story Brand. And I used that book. It's about clarifying your message. And that might be, and this is the thing that you might not know, is that was kind of the beginning of Top Inc. for me, Teaching of Psychology Incubator, which we've done at the annual conference on teaching. That was kind of clarifying for me. It helped me, for example, for Tip Northwest, helped me figure out exactly what our purpose is, why we're coming together, and kind of narrowing all that mission stuff, and then being able to communicate it really clearly to people. And then I realized that their system, if you want to call it that, or what they've tapped into, which I'll maybe talk about in a little bit, but that it works for a lot of different things. And so I was interested, and we haven't obviously dug into it yet, but I was interested, as I used it on all these other kind of ventures, would it work for teaching? Like, and the whole idea is it's the hero's journey. Essentially, that human beings, we are creatures that love story, and stories have a kind of mythical pattern to them that where there's a main character struggles, the main character finds help, overcomes, fights their way out of something, and then in the end finds what they're looking for. And so I was wondering how that could be applied. And so I think that's the backstory. Is that how is that helpful, or did you know all that, or how are you thinking?
I think I knew most of it, but I think the disclosure that you felt like you didn't know what you were doing and you kind of bumbled your way through until you find the right resources resonates with me, because I think every time I've entered a new position or been in a new environment, even though I may have some experience that applies, I feel like I'm bumbling my way through to figure out how to redefine myself. So I think that process is very, very familiar.
Do you remember a recent time when you bumbled?
I would say the last major time I had that bumbling was when I moved down to Pensacola to take the dean's job. I knew how deans were supposed to behave, but I had never been one. And I remember the first day of work, driving to work, I got lost. And I remember calling my husband. I don't think I was crying, but I was thinking, could this be a metaphor for having taken the wrong turn in life, that I can't even find where my office is? And, when you're a dean, people don't watch you come and go, which is one of the things that I learned relatively quickly. But just at that moment, it was startling to realize how much I really didn't know about what was going to be expected of me. So bumbling. Yeah. You bumble, or you fake your way until you can realize whatever the role demands.
Do you think that people who bumble, because I think we all do, and I think that's one of the great things about learning new skills or whatever, is that there is this period where you don't know something and then you figure it out. I think we've all come through the pandemic that way, where there's a lot we didn't know maybe about technology or about how to do things in a new way, and we figured it out.
I mean, I think where you're going is talking about the novice to expert continuum, and how in the beginning, the learning curve is just so steep. And in fact, as a COVID example, I'm a sort of slow adapter when it comes to technology. And so when we had so little notice to move online, that just seemed like a mountainous curve to learn. And even now, when technology changes, I still revert to being a bumbler. And now my students are sort of used to the fact that I'm going to say, somebody jump up here and help me figure this out, so that we can get the class moving. And I do require them to applaud me when I'm able to get through a technology sequence without making a mistake. So here it is. I'm in week 6 of the fall term. I know you've just started your term, but I'm now able to get through my entire week without making too many mistakes. But, on that front end, it's that bumbler thing again. It's like, okay, now here's a brand new group of students. Do I have to out myself as a doofus when it comes to technology? And I usually do. And they think it's funny.
A lot of people get through in that bumbling phase. I don't know if they ever feel like they've got things kind of together. And so that, we talk about being an imposter, feeling like an imposter a lot. From my interviews with probably hundreds of people at this point, that is the norm. It is not the exception that people feel like they are faking it, and even well into career, I think. And so, I think that is, as I think about story, and I think about this common story, this thread that runs through maybe many teachers and probably even outside of teachers, professionals. One of the things that people do need to fight is kind of that enemy of feeling incompetent, inadequate, imposterish, or just bumbling, and what kind of meaning to make of bumbling. But it sounds like you're okay with bumbling. Oh,
absolutely. I think if you're an educator and you recognize the developmental nature of learning, I'm a true fan of thinking about things from a novice to expert strategy, because I think it gives a lot of latitude for people who are just starting to learn. And in fact, whatever the agenda is, I tend to be most excited about working with bumblers, because they're the most fun. They will be the most tail wagging when they're learning, because it's exciting. I love working with freshmen. I love working with brand new teachers, because there's just so much to learn. Yeah, so I have to say I don't find that I experience imposter phenomenon at all. Maybe in the beginning I did, but it's a little bit more useful to think of, here I am on the continuum. I'm just starting out, and I'm going to cut myself a lot of slack if I don't know how to do stuff.
I was reading a book recently, and they were talking about how children these days are so protected from not only, even walking to school and back, like maybe what we did when we were little. And so they don't build this resilience within them. They don't get these lessons because they're so protected of kind of getting into complicated situations or something like that. And feeling like they have the tools, the skills to be able to, get out of it. And I kind of see that with, if we don't put ourselves into positions of bumbling, that we will never be comfortable with the uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it also means that you have to be comfortable. And I think this is important as an educator. You have to be comfortable with owning your mistakes, whether those happen in classes from day to day, or whether they're examples that you can produce in whatever point you're trying to make. In fact, just this week in my capstone class, we were talking about getting ready for job interviews. And I shared with them that my friends at JMU will resonate with this, that when I applied for my job at JMU, when I was director of the school there for 5 years, and they brought me in for my job interview, I was in the middle of my job talk when I looked down and saw I was wearing 2 different color shoes. So that was a little jarring, kind of just an out-of-body experience while I'm still trying to make sense of whatever it is I'm saying, but thinking, oh my God, look what I've done. And I recovered my poise and continued, but it wasn't until after I got the job and I'd been there a while that I was having lunch with some of the women faculty, and shoes came up. And so I said, I wondered if anybody noticed in my job talk, and I didn't even get the sentence out before somebody said, oh yeah, we noticed. So that made a good lesson. It's sort of self-denigrating, which I know students thoroughly enjoy when we put ourselves in the situation of saying, yeah, let me tell you about a mistake I made. And then it underscores the value of what you learn from making mistakes. I always check the color of my shoes now to make sure that I'm not walking out of the house mismatched. And that was the result of making that error.
Yeah, well, when I had this idea that I floated to you probably at the end of spring, even ideas I feel are like the nature of creating is that you are bumbling. I don't know what it, and you and I, we've talked about this. We both agree that sometimes it feels almost more like it comes from outside of you. We know it comes from within you, but it sometimes feels like that muse that taps you on the shoulder and says, "Do this now." And sometimes I have found that you don't get the next step. You just get the first step. You get it's like having a flashlight in a cave, and you get to look at the 3 feet in front of you, and you don't get all of but that is what you're talking about for those folks who like that. That's an exciting place to be.
It's a very exciting place to be.
But I've definitely, when I had this idea, it's not an idea I'd want to share with everybody. And I think this is the thing with ideas. You have to find people who will. I didn't know if you'd be interested or not, but I did know that if you weren't interested, you'd tell me why. I'd probably learn something about it. And here we are months later, and we're going to have conversations about kind of where this goes. So that's fun.
Well, and it's interesting that you invoke the muse here, because that's exactly what happened when I figured out why I was being so sluggish in response. Usually my best muse visits are in the morning. And I remember waking up and thinking, I got to call Garth, and I got to figure out what's keeping you from saying yes, because normally I will jump into anything with friends ask me if I can manage it. Mm-hmm. And then I started thinking, and then it occurred to me, there it is, it bloomed. It's like, this is your story. This is the thing that drives who you are, mm-hmm. and how great that is. And I do want to ask you some questions so the audience will understand even better what that hero journey looks like as a teacher for you. But it occurred to me that I don't think of myself as a hero, and that would probably make it more difficult for me just to jump in and say, well, yes, let's celebrate this way of being. And then I started thinking, well, if I'm not a hero, then what am I? And then that put me in touch with some work that I've done historically over time, which is to encourage people to think through what their metaphor is for teaching. And while mine has changed over time, my metaphor tends to be that I'm a disturber of the peace, that I like to rattle people's cages. I like to rattle student cages in particular. And that metaphor kind of, for me, puts students smack dab in the middle of the experience. And so that's why the hero felt too me-centric.
Yep.
Whereas my metaphor that I've embraced means that I'm locked in combat or locked in struggle or wrestling with students trying to get to a different place in life.
Mm. When I was sending those emails to you about this, every time I would send them, and they were lengthy, but I would send an email, a couple paragraphs or whatever, and then I would hit that send button, and then I would think to myself, that's not it. That's not what it's not coming through. And that happened, I think, twice when in our correspondences. And even now, when you are when you said, and what I really picked up on your email, which is I want to be student-centered, and this seems kind of teacher-centered. And I still thought, well, I need to have a conversation with Jane to explain how I see this, and it might be a little bit different. So we'll talk about that. But essentially, and when people hear the word hero, we're not talking like Avengers, Superman, whatever. We're just talking about the greatness within people that can be unlocked once they face whatever those foes are that they need to face. And here is where I was stuck in those early conversations, because the hero, every teacher is on a hero's journey. and every student is on a hero's journey. Now, when this metaphor is used for business, what the idea is, or like in a business setting. So if you want somebody to, if I'm selling paint and I want somebody to purchase my paint, myself and my paint store, we are not the heroes. Our job, in order to get you to listen to us, is to guide you and to make you, as the consumer of paint, feel like you're the hero and we're just here to help you on your journey become the hero. So there are two things that with this metaphor that there's two possibilities and I was uncertain. Are there folks like you and me out there? And I'm in mid-careers right now. And so it's hard for me to put myself here because I still have so much to learn. But is there something that we have learned that, and I think the answer is yes, that we can be a guide to people for instructors? And I think this is actually what you've already been doing for the last however many decades, that you are the guide that will help instructors become more heroic in their teaching. But there's also this second piece, which is teachers are the guides for their students to become heroic in their learning. And so, if this idea was a book, that's two books. It's not just one. How do you hear that?
Well, I think I resonate more with the second version because I think it corresponds more to a student-centered approach. Mm-hmm. And even though you say in the first version, the hero is in service to others, I'm not sure that always comes through when you describe it as a hero's journey, because there again, the emphasis is on the person in the cape, mm-hmm. As opposed to the person who's being served. So the servant leader model always has just had more appeal for me. And so I think if in fact it's one hero helping students to become heroes in their own stories, I think that fits perfectly well. And it does resonate with one of the things that I'm always trying to help students understand when we're talking about individual differences, which is that everyone is a hero in his or her own narrative. And so that's why when you get into struggles with people, that they will always see themselves as the person who's in the right because they're the hero in that narrative. And once you kind of understand that people take that position, it makes it a little bit easier to negotiate conflict and differences. You can tread a little bit more softly. So hero has a very loaded sense for me. And so I think that initially when you were describing it as the hero's journey, it's like, well, it's too focused on the teacher out of the way I look at things. But that second version fits well.
Yeah, okay. Well, let me ask you about that. If it wasn't hero, if we weren't talking about teachers as heroes, but we were just talking about development of teachers to become better at what they do, to become more confident, to really at the, in a decade or 2 decades or whatever, to feel like you feel when you are not bumbling, when you're very confident about things. If the metaphor changes, I think you agree that it is important to inspire teachers and for them to feel like they're developing. And so how do you manage that? Like, and this is where I guess clarity of message happens, right? You can either talk to teachers about being better teachers for students, and maybe that's the primary way that you would like to think about it. And that would be the student-centered way. But what about just teachers feeling like more confident about themselves, more sure of themselves? Is that a different idea?
I think it might be. I think confidence is something that you're going to get as you progress from novice to expert, if you're reasonable and you pay attention to feedback. But I think over time, when I've worked with teachers and trying to become better teachers, it does help to find out what what is it that they are trying to do in the classroom? So that's where that metaphor idea comes in. For you, that metaphor is a hero. For me, when I started out in teaching, my metaphor was that I was a juggler. It's like, what? Okay, so the thought was, I have all this content that I have to figure out how to keep the balls in the air and keep students' attention. But the fact is, you can juggle without students in the equation, right? And so once I started thinking about, I'm juggling, all I'm doing is I'm really focusing on the content. I'm not focusing on the intersection between the students and the content. And that moment for me was a kind of watershed moment where I went, I don't like that. I got to change metaphors. I've got to figure out a way to make more real what I think I'm trying to do with students, which is ultimately I want to help transform their lives, whether they want me to or not. And so eventually that's where I migrated toward, well, I'm gonna disturb their peace. They may not be on board with me in the beginning about where I want to take them. They may be coming to class with the idea that they're just here for credits, and I'm going to try to seduce them like crazy into liking the material that I'm going to produce, but I'm going to do that by trying to knock them off balance a little bit, gently, but I'm going to knock them off balance.
Okay, give me an example, because what we're talking about is metaphors. So I want to let's stick a pin in that and come back just to metaphors. But
Sure.
I'm interested in an example of how you might kind of knock somebody around a little bit.
I would, knock somebody. That sounds more aggressive than I really am in my classes. But I
shaking
would
the cage.
Say, shake their cage and try to be enticing in their learning. So just one simple example is that when I'm working with students in let's say my history capstone, and students love history of psychology. I'm saying that with sarcasm, but I love to teach history of psychology. And what I've learned is I don't say to them, you're going to do a literature review in this class, even though that's what they're going to do. I say, you're going to solve a mystery in history. You're going to be able to become an expert in this field that's smarter than anyone in the room, including me. And that right there takes them back, because it's jarring for them to think that they would be smarter than me in some way in the course of the semester. And also that dangling, I can, I'm going to be in this class and I can solve something that people don't know about. Well, how cool is that? Well, that virtually defines research. But when you say to students, we're going to do a research paper, well, get the yawns out and the eyeball rolls, because that sounds boring. But a history mystery has a way of engaging people and giving them forward momentum. So it disturbs the peace in that positive way.
I'm sure this has been more of a kind of a developmental thing for you, where you saw something that worked and you're like, what was that? And I need to do more of that. But do you sit around looking at assignments and thinking of assignments and think, no, that's too on the nose. We need to come through the side door with this one?
I have to say, I consider all the work that I do is, I think the word is iterative, that it just continuously recycles and recycles and recycles based on what I learned from students. So I'm never really completely satisfied with what the design is. One of my mentors once said, the thing about education is it never settles down. It's like, what?
Yeah.
It doesn't settle down, because your students are going to be slightly different every semester. And the set of instructions that work brilliantly in one semester is going to fall flat on its face in another semester. And you kind of that's where you're off balance a lot. And maybe the trick there is not to freak out when your own piece gets disturbed. It's like, oh, that didn't work, so let's try something else.
Yeah. Now that I'm listening for metaphors, they're all over the place, right?
They
like
are.
Disturbance would be a type of metaphor. And I know that when we were working with the Intro Psych Initiative, your team, affectionately known as the Woolly Mammoths,
Yes.
you all came up with some integrative themes for the student learning outcomes. And then one of the conversations we had at some point was, how how do we communicate these to people in the way that they'll really get it? And one of the metaphors that we use is weaving. That these things get weaved. So when you were talking about juggling, I was like, well, what is the next iteration of juggling? Well, it might be weaving, or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. What other metaphors have you heard, or could we kind of kick around that might apply to teaching? Any off the top of your head?
Yeah, in the past, I've worked with people who have come up with that they think of themselves as a butterfly, in that they start out being kind of in a cocoon, and then they emerge and they hope it's something beautiful at the end, which is kind of nice. I've heard sculpting. I've heard dancing. I mean, I think one of the things I like about approaching how you're aspiring to be a teacher from a metaphor is that it does produce a full range of examples. I did hear organ grinder once, which is kind of interesting. It's like, are there monkeys in that one? And,
organ grinder as in the instrument.
Yeah, like you've got an organ grinder is the person that used to be a busker on the streets trying to get money, and you had a monkey that was dancing. So you can see that some metaphors, when you hear them, you scratch your head and go, ooh, you better tell me about that, because where I'm going with this is probably not what you want. So I think it's a fairly personal experience. In fact, it's probably not a bad thing for listeners even to think about, well, what is my metaphor? What is it that I am attempting to be? What is it that I'm attempting to accomplish? And is there some concrete way of expressing that? Because at least what I found is, once I embraced the great disruptor, that was very liberating for me, to be able to recognize that I'm on purpose going to be putting students off balance, because I think in the best Piaget sense of the word, they're going to right themselves, and when they right themselves, they're going to be better off for that experience.
Yeah. I really like that. It's an interesting way to approach student learning, because you're kind of students don't know what they're in for, right? I think students
they don't.
Yeah,
no.
They don't. And do you foresee that this is going to be the way that the metaphor that will shape kind of your teaching until you retire?
Whenever that is, I suspect. I'm pretty happy with it. In fact, I even found a little image that I use. If people have seen presentations that I've made, usually the very last slide shows this kind of funky little guy who's playing a tuba, and in the print it says "Disturber of the Peace." And so that, for me, is that way of communicating that guiding light. But we've talked a lot about my metaphor, and I think it might be more helpful to talk about why the hero's journey appeals to you in the way it does. What is it about that metaphor speaks to you? Why is that so powerful?
Yeah, I think I really am interested in mythology and myth. So, Joseph Campbell wrote a lot about this and spoke a lot about it. And even before that, you can find this pattern of the hero's journey in basically every historical literature, whether religious or not. But this journey that people go through, it's a developmental journey that we are, faced with. And I think it really resonates with me, but I think more broadly, I think with people. I think it resonates on some deeper level than just conscious level, like processing. Like we might not know that it is speaking to us consciously, and then something within us is drawn emotionally or motivationally or something like that to the message. And the message ultimately is, I'm here for something more, something greater. This is a process. There's going to be ups and downs. There's a lot at stake here. There is, if I don't do this, get this, achieve this, learn this, the consequences are dire. If I do, it's transformational. It's probably going to be everything I was hoping for. And so I find that I also find the magic of it pretty interesting too. The fact that there's always a guide, and we can look back on our lives and say, yeah, that person was a guide for me at that period of time, or whatever. We might call them mentors in our field right now. But I like the idea, because I think if you can tell that story right, it resonates for teachers. And I think what I was inviting you to do is help me tell the story for teachers, because I know what the steps are. But for example, when we say that there is an enemy, there's a dragon that needs to be slayed by teachers, I don't know what that dragon is.
I was just going to ask you if there'd be dragons in this story. So that's interesting that you leaped right into where I was going to take you.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why were you thinking dragons?
Because I think the hero myth that you're talking about, in order for the story to be an interesting one, there has to be some high drama, and you can't get much more dramatic than dragons. Yep. Right. So that's what I was thinking. And if there are, pushing that a little bit, if there are dragons right now, I'm sure there are listeners out there who might think of their department head, dean, or president as the dragon that's making life a bit challenging for them. So it might be institutionally, there are some things that get in the way of keeping us from being our best teacher. But the dragons of teaching, let me think about this. I guess for me, one dragon would be the drag that happens in classes when students fail to engage, and when we fail to engage them. Yeah. So that you can see them sinking in their chairs, you can see them reaching for their phones. That for me, that's one of those enemies. That's a dragon.
That's interesting. When you were talking, I'm having this any person who was born around late 70s, early 80s, like myself, the Super Mario Brothers video game had you. Well, I guess they're going on. Really, it was the hero's journey, right? But it wasn't one dragon, and I think this is what you're kind of picking up on. It's every level had a dragon on it. Every level was, and so when you're talking about iteration, I think it's not one time. It's this dragon now, and then it's that dragon later, and different dragons at different points in your career as well. Different politics to navigate, as you said. And I could think about like kind of external forces being barriers to us, but then also there's the internal, which I think we've touched on as well, which is the feeling like an imposter or not having the skill set, wanting to try something new, but feeling basically incompetent at it. And for those folks who would, and for the hero that would, or the non-hero who would take this safe way through and not challenge themselves, not make themselves vulnerable, I think you also just, in the end, the metaphor says you miss out on coming home a transformed person to back and kind of all the good that you can do having had that journey. So
I think that's a really good insight. And I think in particular, it speaks to the brand new teacher who goes into the classroom and feels compelled to be an expert on everything. And so when students ask questions, some teachers deal with that by saying, don't ask me questions, which is sad. Other teachers deal with questions by punting and hoping no one knows the answer, because then they'll be exposed. Whereas I think a great liberating force, get your cape out, is to be able to say, wow, what a great question. I don't know the answer to that at all. What do you think? And then convene that as an opportunity for students, again, to jump in, to let themselves get unbalanced, to take a risk, to be able to see what they can do to penetrate whatever the mystery is that's at hand.
Yeah.
And that takes a little while. Brand new teachers, you're so nervous about students thinking that you don't know your stuff. that to admit that you don't know something is just painful. And so people don't tend to do that. But I think once you can embrace, oh, there's so much I don't know. And yeah, you asked a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Mm-hmm. In fact, that just happened to me yesterday. I had a student, we were talking about gender issues in social, and I made a comment about differences in aggression patterns between males and females. And the student said, oh yeah, what's your evidence for that? And, in just at that moment, I had no study at my fingertips. So I said, well, you got me. I don't have it at this moment, but I'll have it shortly. And so this morning I emailed my students and said, well, here's some evidence that supports what it was I was saying. And I congratulated the student for challenging me on that point, because that's what I'm trying to do, to get students to say, what's your evidence for believing what you believe? And so to have it happen in class that was, a brand new teacher might be thrown off balance and might be unhappy. But I thought that was terrific. I thought it was terrific.
Yeah. If you have a strong metaphor, I feel like it can hold those experiences. Take the butterfly. I don't even know where I'm going with this, but I'll take the butterfly, for example. Okay. But if I'm an early career and I have this metaphor, and I know that teaching is, this transformational kind of butterfly experience for me, I also know that in that moment, when it feels like that student could feel like that student's coming after me, questioning me, and I could get very defensive. It might be something to hold on to in those moments and say, this is part of the process. This is part of the metaphor. And that can change everything very, very quickly. It can make you feel less flustered, maybe less defensive, less of an imposter, whatever those things are. If we do multiple conversations for kind of this little podcast series, at this point, what are you thinking these conversations should be about? Because I could think of going a couple different ways, but maybe I'll just throw to you for a moment.
If we were to do multiple ones, I think it would be fun to convene some legendary teachers to get them to talk about what their driving metaphors are, because you and I both have something that we hold on to that nourishes what we do. And I think it would be pretty interesting to be able to get that from some other people. So that would be one direction. Another direction could be perhaps I could interview you a bit more about the impact of what it means on a day-to-day basis for you to have the hero metaphor. What does it mean for your planning? What does it mean for when things go well? What does it mean if things fall and crash? How might that support who you are? So that's another possibility.
Yeah. And I mean, we could definitely take a dive into yours as well. And how you actually work that out. And we've talked about some of that. And I think the difference is that you sort of know how you're working it out. And for me, one of the metaphor sits well with me. The hero metaphor sits well, but I'm not sure how it's worked out. I think I sent you a list of like 9 stages. And I don't know what all those things are, as I kind of discussed. So it feels right to maybe back off. By the way, I love the idea of looking at different metaphors. So maybe this is just all of the above. I'm not sure.
Okay.
The good news is we get to do whatever we want. So.
That's true. That part I love. By the way, I did think of one other metaphor that it might be reasonable to be closing in on, which is someone once said, I'm a mushroom farmer. Like, okay, explain that. Well, my students are the mushrooms and I throw manure on them and make them grow. It's like, okay, so I think that probably communicates more about what you think of the profession than you may really want to intend. But that's what's really fun about the metaphors, is there are subtexts that when you identify what you're talking about, you may not, when I said I was a juggler, I didn't get my own subtext until I was able to stand back and look at it and go, oh, wait a minute, I don't like that. If that's what I really think, then I've got to change my style.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The manure metaphor is kind of fun because we might say that it's your content, really. If we want to grow skill skill-based mushrooms. That the content it feeds it, but it is it in itself is not the, it's not the gold. It's
correct,
in fact
but
the opposite.
it is also. I mean, the other thing that I look at in metaphors is there any interaction going on there? Is there anything that's two-way between the teacher and the mushroom? And no, there's not. This is just the teacher heaping dung on the student and hoping that some of them will make their way through the pile and become edible. Okay, that's stretching the metaphor a bit far, I have to admit. That's kind of bad.
Well, yeah, I'm feeling like I still have work to do, and I'd like for you to push me on it, because in this teaching metaphor, you're right, there's a lack of students. If it's an individual journey, I don't know yet how students fit into that. But as you and I were talking about Parker Palmer's book,
yes,
called, help me,
Courage to Teach.
Yep, Courage to Teach. If I remember, it's very individualistic. It is about the calling, right? And so this reminds me a little bit of my training as a therapist, which was in a family systems therapy, essentially. But in a relationship or in a system, if you have one person who is helping themselves, figuring out how to set boundaries, figuring out how to communicate better, how to get their needs met, getting help, essentially making themselves better, the whole system rises because of that. Now the system doesn't like it.
True enough.
Yeah, but the system gets healthier. So because that person is now not in the muck. And so I wonder if there is something here, and maybe it's not a perfect metaphor, but I wonder if there's something here about when people do feel called and they have this clear sense of what their purpose is and who the foes are, and whether internal or external, and they're looking towards, slaying dragons and the transformation and the wins afterwards and what that means. Does that somehow, even if it's not directly involved with students, does that make this person better at what they do? I don't know, with students. Yeah.
Well, and I suspect when I was a juggler, I was still a fine teacher. So I don't think the metaphor, your choice of metaphor, either secures or dooms you to a particular kind of future. But I would agree with you that the individualistic focus of Palmer's book, and maybe the concept hero's journey, doesn't feel like it's taking people along in the way that I know you do as a teacher. And so I would say, yeah, that I don't know, the hero's bus tour. Is there something that needs to be amended in there so that it feels more directly in service? Or maybe try this one out. Maybe it's that you're a hero maker, that in fact what you're focusing on is helping people be heroic by the transformation that they experience in their studying with you. Mm-hmm. That also tends to make it a bit more student-centered, but that's clearly my bias.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely apply this to students really easily, but that is not right now. The call here right now is to try to figure out what this means for teachers. And it's funny that I know that you're talking now I'm talking about teachers kind of as a group of people and not as Garth, the individual, because I actually haven't even applied this to myself quite yet. And so I don't know that it's the best metaphor for me. Okay. But I do think it's an interesting metaphor. The last thing I will say is when the hero leaves home, I think that there's something there about leaving your students, and then returning to your students a changed instructor, at having gone through all those things. Now, the interesting thing is we're never without students. So even during those times where we're out slaying dragons, we're still teaching on the side, right? And so it's not like you are physically or metaphorically even leaving. And yet And yet you do, after you have certain experiences, build certain skills, after you bumble around a little bit, you do come back changed. So yeah, let's put a pin in this. You and I will talk on the side, and we'll come back with episode 2.
Okay, sounds good.